Welcome. My name is Bram van Vlijmen, and you are about to watch a presentation on my design for the biggest hydrogen factory in the world, for the graduation studio of 2022 on the Academy of Building Arts in Tilburg. Just like with the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine nowadays, the war that made other countries decide to boycott Russian oil and gas, about 100 years ago, the First World War made the Dutch government decide the Netherlands needed to be independent of Russian steel. We started producing our own steel in the newly built Royal Dutch blast furnaces, located in IJmuiden. Today these blast furnaces have grown out into Tata Steel, one of the biggest steel manufacturers in the world. Tata Steel IJmuiden produces more than 7 million tons of steel annually, which is the same amount as the whole of the Netherlands uses each year. For its location, preference was given to IJmuiden because of its good supply and discharge options via the North Sea Canal that connects Amsterdam to the North Sea. The industrial terrain took up the place of a former nature reserve called the Breesaap in between the villages of Wijk aan Zee and IJmuiden, and it is surrounded by two protected nature reserves today, called het Noord-Hollands Duinreservaat and Zuid-Kennemerland. This means that the industrial terrain is directly surrounded by nature and humans. Although it forms an interesting contrast between the industry and living, not all locals are very happy with their neighbor. Tata Steel IJmuiden is the largest industrial CO2 and lead emitter in the Netherlands. They produce 12 million tons of CO2 annually and are therefore responsible for approximately 7% of the total CO2 emissions of the Netherlands. You need to plant a rainforest the size of the provinces of Utrecht and Noord-Holland to capture this much CO2 every year. If we try to compensate the CO2 pollution of the Netherlands at the current pollution rate, the whole of the Netherlands would be a rainforest in 7.5 years. The company's heavy nitrogen emissions also have major consequences for the biodiversity in the adjacent dune area. Because of the impact on the environment, dust and odor nuisance, and the lack of clarity about the health consequences of that nuisance for humans, Tata Steel has become one of the most controversial companies in the Netherlands. The Clean or Stop ruling of the Dutch House of Representatives from last September is a reality check for Tata Steel. The company only has a future in the Netherlands if action is taken now to stop the pollution. I want Tata Steel to not only become non-pollutive and sustainable in the future, but also nature inclusive, entertaining, involving and educative. My design for the biggest hydrogen factory in the world, that will enable the production of CO2 neutral steel, will replace the old pollutive factories by turning the opened up terrain into a campus and nature reserve for the public to experience the new sustainable ways of steel producing and the revived dune landscape. The annually 1.3 million cubic meters of excess dredging sands from the IJssel and the IJmuiden Lock will be used to create strategically placed 5 to 10 meter high sand drifting dunes that spray calcareous sands up to 500 meters over the opened up industrial terrain to battle further nitrification and acidification of the soil. This increases the biodiversity by bringing back dune-specific flora and fauna. Biogrout technology from the TU Delft will be used to turn the sand into man-made sandstone cavities inside of these dunes. Natural calcareous sandstone needs thousands of years for its diagenesis, but this new technology applied on loose sand only takes days to convert it into sandstone with an unconfined compressive strength of up to 35 megapascal, which is comparable to high-strength concrete. Bacteria are injected into the sand, followed up by urea and calcium chloride. The bacteria produce carbonate ions from the urea in the soil that immediately bind with the calcium ions to form calcite, which cements sand grains together to form porous sand-lime brick. To be able to withstand the outside pressure from the dune sand, the cavities are constructed by 3D printing to form sandstone domes. These consist of small layers of sand that can be rinsed with urea and calcium chloride to reach the needed compressive strength. The cavities in between can be filled with sand manually, receive extra rinsing, and be equipped with the needed piping. The result is an organically looking, naturally colored horizontal layering of the dome walls that capture the light of the oculuses, sprouting like stone chimneys from the dunes to bring in natural lighting beautifully. Residual heat producing components of the hydrogen factory will be placed inside of these sand cathedrals, so we can harvest the rest warmth. In this picture you can see a section of an electrolyzing room, where water gets split into oxygen and hydrogen, to be used as fuel and as a reducting agent, instead of coal in the steel making process. In the public viewing chambers, the public can look down on the industrial processes from above through a double glass pipe rack floor that harvests warmed up air without disturbing the processes on the work floor beneath it. Natural lighting comes in from above, showing the contrast between the naturally looking sandstone cavity walls and the steel industrial floor and installations. The electrolyzer cells have inbuilt lighting that emit a green light from the water tanks below, showing the electrolyzing process. Every electrolyzer cell is internally equipped with a water-to-water cooling system that can transport warmed-up water underground and is connected to a pipeline system that transports the harvested hydrogen and oxygen above ground through the glass floor to the pipe racks spanning the industrial road outside that connects all harvesting rooms from maintenance. The floor and walls of the electrolyzer room are also equipped with water cooling. The width of the sandstone walls start at about 1 meter at the bottom, going down to about 500 to 700 centimeters at the oculus, depending on the height of the room. The foundation consists of a 1 meter thick slab of concrete, with a layer of recycled foam glass from the demolished factories on top, carrying the water supply pipes, to be finished with a power-floated concrete top layer supplying water cooling. The residual heat will be used to heat up the old Averij-haven on site, to turn it into a spa for the public to enjoy. This will turn the site into a touristic hotspot, with the goal of luring people in and take them on a touristic tour through the campus and nature reserve, to teach them about the new sustainable ways of steel producing, to clear Tata Steel's bad name, as motivation of conservation of the dune landscape, and to induce spin-off activities for the disadvantaged locals. The spa is even connected to the very popular recreational and kitesurf beaches. In this image, one of those dunes, the harbor electrolyzer, is visible, showing the spa in the background. It is connected to the old coal harbor that has been transformed to a touristic harbor, bringing the public in through a high-speed boat lift from Amsterdam. In this picture, the harbor electrolyzer is shown in a transparent axonometry, showing each dune factory, future industrial installations, in this case to the right of the industrial road, as well as public facilities, seen on the left. Here, the floor plan of the electrolyzer dune is depicted, showing the routing the visitor takes after entering the lobby through the main entrance that is connected to the harbor. After the check-in, the visitor enters the main hall. The main hall looks out over the transformator rectifiers that power the electrolyzers and the industrial road that cuts right through the dune and dome, making sure trucks can reach the industrial installations. The incision emphasizes the strong contrast between the rigid industrial installations and the organic form language of the sandstone cavities and dunes. Here, the visitor can choose to take the spiral staircase that reaches to a 5-meter high public walking path on the pipe racks above the industrial roads, leading to the industrial viewing chambers, and a lookout point on top of the dune, or enjoy the public facilities each factory dune is equipped with. The harbor electrolyzer forms the start of the touristic tour after visitors arrive by boat. Therefore, it is equipped with restrooms and a restaurant that feature outside terraces overlooking the old iron fields that have been transformed to a slougher that brings in new saltwater biotopes to the site, something I will talk about later. Other facilities that can be reached through the main hall are the information center and the gallery. This picture shows a section of the gallery that holds an exposition on the new sustainable ways of steel producing and houses Tata Steel's museum collection on their history. Also, a touristic tour led by a forester dispatches here into the revived dune landscape with the goal of informing and maintaining the nature reserve through public participation. If we zoom in on the gallery, we can see the oculus of the dome bringing in natural lighting. Every room has its lighting chimney strategically oriented to the required sun position, depending on its room function. I wanted to construct the new factory with natural material to celebrate my fascination for the aesthetics of the current Tata Steel site, with its convergence of rigid steel factories and natural dunes, like you can see in the background, and what to do that better with than with the omnipresent sand. These sandstone walls have a comparable build-up to the walls of the electrolyzer room, but with a slight difference in the floor composition. I have replaced the power-floated concrete finishing in the publicly accessible rooms for a layer of man-made sandstone, leveled out with transparent epoxy resin to enlarge the feeling of being completely submerged in a sandstone cavity. A 7-meter wide industrial road cuts through the dune, making sure all installations are reachable by trucks for maintenance. I lifted the pipe racks that transport the produced oxygen and hydrogen to the purifiers and compressors above this industrial road to become a public walking path that leads the visitors from factory dune to factory dune, all the while crossing different dune biotopes to see and learn about. The walls next to the industrial road have a width of 1 to 1.5 meters at the bottom and 700 centimeters to 1 meter at the top. Biodegradable mats of potato starch enable plant growth to fixate sand at the top of the dune next to the road gap. This top layer of sand comes from microplastic-free sand layers in the North Sea, where it was harvested during the boring of the energy pipeline to the new wind turbine fields that will power the hydrogen factory. The sand used under the industrial road is the rinsed top layer from the old coal and iron fields. Above that, a layer of rubble and glass foam, retrieved from the demolished factories, is provided under the asphalt. A 3D printed elongated tip on top of the wall enables swallow nest building. Swallows are an endangered bird species living in the excavations on the Tata Steel site. The public viewing chambers can be reached from this walking path. Here the choice can be made to resume the tour on the pipe racks above the roads or to venture down into the revived moist dune valleys. These lifted pipe racks form a network of walking paths through the dunes in which the residual heat harvesting takes place, leading the visitor from the harbor through all the different dune factories to the spa and beach. All other non-heat producing installations are placed in the open air along the road for the public to see. But why did I completely redesign the industrial site into a revived dune reserve with a publicly accessible hydrogen factory? To understand this, we need to know a bit more about the steps necessary to battle pollution and revive biodiversity levels in dune areas. Step 1. Stop Tata Steel pollution. To understand the nature of the pollution, we need to understand that Tata Steel pollution is part of a bigger problem, namely diffuse pollution sources like the global nitrogen deposition and acidic rain. But the nature around Tata Steel is extra polluted because Tata Steel is a heavy point source polluter. Our course of action is to 1. Stop Tata Steel pollution, 2. Clean up Tata Steel pollution, and 3. Long-term routine maintenance. The old way of iron producing uses pre-worked forms of coal and iron ore, made in the pellet, sinter and Cooks factories. These react with each other in the blast furnaces to create raw iron. The byproducts of this reaction are carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Tata Steel will have to start producing CO2 neutral steel for our country to get in line with the signing of the Paris Accord. 300 million euros are at the ready to start investing in new factories that enable the production of CO2 neutral steel through green hydrogen usage, called direct reduced iron. Green energy from offshore wind farms will enable the production of green hydrogen through the electrolysis of water in the new hydrogen factory. The hydrogen will serve both as fuel and as a reduction agent instead of coal, making all the polluting black site factories obsolete. The byproduct of this reaction is water, which can be used again to repeat the process. Here we can see the current state of the Tata Steel terrain. Coal and iron ore come in through the North Sea Channel, ending up in the coal and iron ore fields. From here the product makes a circular movement over the terrain. First the coal and ore get pre-worked by the sinter, pellet and Cooks factories before ending up in the blast furnaces. After this the raw iron gets worked into slabs of steel in the Oxy steel plant. The steel gets rolled out in the rolling mills and or painted in the paint line, after which it ends up in the packaging center. From here it gets transported out by train or ship. Here we can see a plan view of the site. All demolishable factories, asphalt and terrain under development is shown in red and orange. After demolition, this leaves us with all the black space for future developments. Tata Steel will have to replace the old blast furnaces with 3 direct produced iron plants and 5 electric ovens that run on hydrogen instead of coal. 3 wind turbine parks will be built in the North Sea that produce 2 gigawatt of energy, made available in the new transformator station on site. My design for the largest hydrogen factory in the world needs 500 megawatts of energy. There is 4 times as much energy available, meaning that the new DRI plants will be connected to an international hydrogen backbone. The Eigel that lets sea ships enter the North Sea Canal is continuously dredged to prevent silting. Dredging of the Eigel and the largest lock in the world produce 1.3 million cubic meters of excess dredge sand per year. Tata Steel plans to build a 50-meter high mega dune to block dust and sound nuisance to Wijk aan Zee. I will use the excess dredge sand to build this mega dune and place all new heat-producing factories, DRI and E-ovens, inside to harvest the residual heat. The rest of the excess dredge sand will be used to create new factory dunes, following the geomorphology of the now vacant old coal and iron fields for the new hydrogen factory. Tata Steel has made a design for a 100 megawatt hydrogen factory. The whole process revolves around the electrolyzer building in the middle, where water gets polarized into hydrogen and oxygen. An industrial road with pipe racks surrounds the main components for accessibility and maintenance purposes. Other installations like transformators, compressors, purifiers, release stacks, electronic filters and water cooling towers can be found in the periphery. My design for the biggest hydrogen factory in the world will be upgraded to a 500 megawatt factory. This means the core gets multiplied by 5 and the periphery by 1.5. The trafo cells, electrolyzers and compressors produce an enormous amount of residual heat. 1/3 of the 500 megawatt input transforms to 167 megawatts of rest warmth. This is the equivalent to the power usage of 167,000 households, but Tata Steel destroys this in cooling towers. Unfortunately, the 750-hectare terrain is too big and the surrounding villages too small and far away to be heated by the residual heat, but it can be used to heat up the old Averrijhaven to turn it into a spa. Here we can see the new hydrogen factory terrain layout in the former coal and iron ore fields. Green energy comes in from the transformator station to end up at the trafo cells after getting pre-worked. From here it powers the 5 100 megawatt electrolyzer dunes. Oxygen and hydrogen get transported to the compressors, purifiers and release stacks through the lifted pipe racks above the industrial roads, after which it goes to the DRI plants and E-ovens. The harvested residual heat gets transported underground to the water cooling towers and the spa that is connected to the popular recreational and kitesurf beaches. Step 2 and 3. Clean up Tata Steel pollution and long-term maintenance. The 300-kilometer long dune landscape of the Netherlands is our richest ecological organ. It houses 70% of all Dutch flora species with 10% specific to it. This makes the dune landscape valuable and in many cases protected nature reserves. Due to the global nitrification and acidification, we can see nationwide biodiversity decline in our dune landscapes. There is an even bigger local biodiversity decline around Tata Steel. Grass, shrubs and trees take over from the dune-specific flora because they are nitrogen and acidic soil-loving species. Many naturally occurring plants are vanishing altogether or don't produce enough nectar anymore to keep the dune-specific fauna, like wild bees, alive. By cleaning and maintaining these grounds of nitrogen and acid, we can reverse this biodiversity decline. The dune landscape has a natural gradient, going from primary dunes to dune forests. The Tata Steel site now consists of biotopes that are uncommonly monotone, disproportionate and distributed in comparison to the nature reserves surrounding it. My factory dunes will bring back this gradient, to restore the natural balance which is so characteristic of the dune landscape, to restore the threatened flora and fauna. How is my design going to do this? To understand how the whole process of cleaning up and maintaining works, we are first going to zoom in on the creation of open dunes and wet dune valleys. We bring in the excess dredge sand to cover the old coal fields with a substrate layer after removing the contaminated top layer. The top of the factory dunes are covered with old microplastic-free sand from the digging of the energy pipeline at sea. This fertile top layer ensures that dune-specific species start to grow on the nitrogen-poor soil. The wet dune valleys in between the factory dunes are the perfect habitat for target species like the netherjack toad to live in, meaning it will automatically go well with many other types of plants, bees and butterflies. To make sure the ecological problems will not slowly return with the years, routine maintenance will need to take place. One of the main pillars of my design for the hydrogen factory is tourism, because I believe motivation of conservation starts with getting the public involved. In case of the open dune factories, tourists will dig annually rotating sand drifting pits on the southwest side of the 5 to 10 meter high dunes before the storm season begins. These pits spray chalky sand over the acidified grasslands behind the dunes up to 500 meters away. Within a few years, the pits will be filled with dune-specific flora species that form habitats for endangered species like blue-winged grasshoppers, sand lizards, and butterflies. Repeating this process routinely ensures that all dune soil will be covered with original species and that all grassland behind receives calcareous sand. These grasslands are formed on the former blacksite terrain after the factories have been demolished. After removing the polluted top layer of sand, we let tourists place annually harvested hay from the adjacent Kennemerland-Zuid dune valleys to act as a new seed bank. The hay ensures that the flower seeds come up before the grass can and makes soil fungi return. We mow only once a year instead of 15 times, like Tata Steel does now, and let groups of tourists pick exotics from among the dune-specific species during information tours. This creates a flowery area that attracts butterflies from Kennemerland-Zuid and makes a target species like the wheat ear return. A slough will be created on the old iron ore fields. We scrape away the top layer of contaminated ground and break through the harbor quay to let seawater in, which allows salt water to enter the tidal area through the gully under the influence of the tide and strong winds from sea. The creek system receives a supply of fresh sand and nutrients, introducing new saltwater biotopes and bird breeding areas to the terrain. A tour over the revived terrain, led by a forester, will involve and teach locals and tourists about the different biotopes, specific species and maintenance options. In this way, the new nature-inclusive hydrogen factory, together with the public and volunteers, will work together to preserve the reclaimed nature.